Hello and welcome to the DraftKings Daily Trot. I'm Big Italy 42. He is Scott Mailwood, got Sports 25 to life. And we're going to start off talking about starting pitchers. And if you watch the pitcher nail down for some more in-depth analysis on these guys, you'll notice that there's not a whole lot of guys that really stand out. I mean, in cash games, Jacob deGrom's the guy that you want at $12,000. If you could find a way to fit him and Hisashi Iwakuma at $10,200, I mean, that's the ideal combination. Those are the two safest bets. The two guys probably with the highest upside as well. Going to be pretty tough to fit both those guys, though, because if you put them both in, you got $34.75 left per player, which isn't impossible, but certainly there, with this many bad pitchers on the mound, there are some guys you'd like to pay up for if you can, as far as hitters. But, I mean, those two guys, for me especially, just far and away your top two options.
Yeah, I think so too. It's not really even close. The only other guy I would even throw in there a little bit is maybe Lance Lynn against Arizona because they've been struggling, but I mean, Lynn hasn't been great. Arizona's much better at home. So, I mean, that small discount you're getting from Iwakuma just doesn't really do it for me.
Yep.
I think he's an okay cash game play if you need a guy that's going to give you a decent start. But I think you're overpaying for that in general. My other favorite cash game option today on DraftKings is probably J.A. Happ at 5,800. We talked about him a little bit at length on the pitching podcast today against Miami with no Yelich, no Stanton. There's not a lot of guys in that lineup that scare you very much. I mean, Derek Dietrich has been their three-hitter and supplying most of their power recently. Justin Bour hitting fourth, and he hasn't been great either. I think there's some decent upside in innings pitched here. I think you can get through this lineup pretty easily in terms of amount of pitches. He's not going to strike out a ton of guys. Miami doesn't strike out a lot. But for 5,800, there's some decent upside there, and I think you're going to pay off that 5,800 price tag a decent amount of the time.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that this is obviously DraftKings specific because his price elsewhere is not nearly as good. But Jeff Samardzija, probably the other only mid-tier guy that I feel decent about. I mean, it's a Boston team that's been really good, but you know, Samardzija does have good stuff. He struggled really bad for a while there. Maybe he's got it back together, but $6,800, I think he's a much better pitcher than that price indicates, though. Overall.
Yeah, same.
But yeah, outside of that, nobody that I feel like I even want to say here and have you come yell at me on Twitter tomorrow for talking about it. So, catcher options: Brian McCann at home against the righty, $4,100. You got to like him. Couple other options for you there. I like whichever Reds catcher is in tonight because Buck Farmer has been absolutely terrible. He's only pitched 24 innings this year, but he's given up 36 hits and 23 earned runs. Obviously, a dramatic park shift for him, too, at Great American Ballpark tonight. So,
Yep.
Brian McCann going to be your top option, but I don't mind punting. Nathan Eovaldi is bad against lefties, so a tournament option is Jason Castro, who is a lefty with some power. But, yeah, this is one of those situations where you got to imagine McCann's going to be really highly owned. And if you get him in your cash games, if you can, but if not, I'm just going to search for some value down at the bottom.
Yeah, I mean, should be a lot of value today. Jesus Montero against a lefty, probably going to be in the lineup for Seattle against Dubront. I think that's a solid play at 2,200. Anthony Recker, if he's in the lineup at catcher for the Mets, he's been hitting eighth, but he's facing the Philly lefty Adam Morgan. I think you can feel pretty good about that, even with the low batting spot at that price. And then Ryan Lavarnway for Atlanta. If he's in the lineup, he's facing a lefty in De La Rosa for Colorado. He's 2,300. There's going to be a lot of platoon cheap catchers today. I do think McCann's the obvious top play. Like, after that, though, like I'd much rather go with one of these cheap guys than pay like 3,300 for Yadier Molina or 3,400 for Wellington Castillo or 3,200 for Vogt against Iwakuma. I think you're just much better off going the really cheap route.
Yeah, especially if you're paying up for one or both of those top pitchers we mentioned, then you got to save money. And it kind of makes sense for catcher to be the spot where you save a bunch of it. First base options, Joey Votto is my favorite option. I know it feels like I say it all the time, but I mean, Buck Farmer is just an awful pitcher, and he's only in the major leagues because Detroit is, I mean, they have no one else to pitch. They've been unloading guys, and they just, no depth at starting pitcher. Joey Votto, been one of the best hitters in baseball since the All-Star break, WOBA over 500. You got to pay a lot for him, though, so you're not going to be able to get him into your cash games here with any decent pitching, probably at 5,600.
Yeah, right. It makes it really tough. But feels like he's probably worth the price tonight, honestly.
Yeah. I mean, he's in a tremendous spot. So, other guys that you like, if you're looking for a cheap guy, assuming that Mark Teixeira sits again, Greg Bird at $3,500, not a bad option. if you're going cheap. Another guy that I like is Victor Martinez. He's $3,600. Seems to be stuck at that exact same price for seemingly ever now.
He's been pretty bad lately again, though, so that's part of the reason.
Yeah, that's fair.
He definitely feels like he has an upside, though, so I'm definitely in for looking at it. Michael Kadire is a guy that I like at first base, but I like him quite a bit more in the outfield today against a lefty in Morgan. He's probably going to be hitting cleanup with Duda out of the lineup. Only 3,200. He hasn't been very good against lefties this year, but he has been in his career. So I'm going to lean towards his career numbers, especially against a weak lefty like Morgan. Other mid-range guys, there's not a lot I love. I mean, you could look at Ben Paulson, I guess, against Tehran, but I don't love it at 2,900 on the road. I'd probably stick to the top guys. Chris Davis, excellent GPP play against Medlin, and probably a decent amount of bullpen guys. He might only see one or two at-bats against Medlin, so that feels like a pretty strong GPP play to me.
Yeah, and David Ortiz as well. I mean, he's been really good since the All-Star break. If Samar just struggles like he had been there for a while, I don't mind looking his way either. And then, of course, Miguel Cabrera you can look at against the rookie Sampson, but 5,800, if I'm paying up there, I'm just taking Joey Votto. Second base options over here. My favorite is going to be Neil Walker, who just continues to be underpriced at $3,600 against Tom Kohler. Kohler's not awful against lefties. He's slightly below average. He's about one of those pitchers you don't want to necessarily stack against, but you want to get a piece of. Obviously, this being in Miami, it's still a nice pitcher's park, but Neil Walker from left side of the plate at that price, I think just makes a lot of sense in cash games tonight.
Yeah, other second base options. I don't mind Avante Jesus tonight as a pretty cheap option at second base or shortstop against Farmer. He's hitting second in the order, only 2,600. Hard to argue with that. Not a ton else I like at the top. I mean, Ian Kinsler's 4,700. I like the park factor in Cincinnati for him and hitting right in front of Cabrera, but I'm not like super excited about it.
Yeah.
Ben Zobrist at 4,300 against Ubaldo is fine with me, but again, not something I'm in love with. Skip Schumacher is another guy for Cincinnati. I'm guessing he probably leads off today against a righty. That's what he did last time out. He's flat 2,000 against Farmer also. So I think you can get a lot of cheap value on the Reds tonight, honestly, against Farmer.
Yeah, and I mean, twice his price for Brandon Phillips. I mean, he's a guy who looks interesting, but he hasn't had much upside, not much power this year. So if I'm paying that price, I'd rather go with a guy like Zobrist or Neil Walker, personally.
Yep.
Third base, not a particularly great position here either. Todd Frazier's been struggling. He gets Buck Farmer, more of a GPP option, his price for me. A-Rod at 4,500, been killing righties. He gets Scott Feldman, who, I mean, he's not a terrible righty. He's been about an average righty so far this year. And then your cheaper guys, Jung Ho Kang at $3,800, either third base or shortstop, is a guy that I like a lot. I mean, he's got a ton of upside for tournaments.
Yeah. I think you nailed the top guys for the most part. Cheap-wise, I mean, not a ton to really like, honestly. I mean, you got Dietrich, who's been a popular value play, facing a lefty today. I don't feel great about that. He's only got a 250 WOBA against them on the season. One interesting guy is Adonis Garcia for Atlanta against the lefty. He's been really, really solid against lefties with a 318 ISO on the year. He's only 2,400 on DraftKings. Has outfield eligibility too. I prefer him at third base because there's not a ton I like price-wise at third base. So I'm going to look at that a little bit. And then Casey McGee for Miami has been the one guy for Miami that's been hitting lefties really well. He's probably going to hit fifth or sixth today, and he's flat minimum at 2,000.
Yeah, I like that. And then another cheap guy, Marwin Gonzalez, if he's in the lineup at $2,800. Eovaldi struggles a lot with lefties. Obviously, he's a switch hitter, so I like him. And then shortstop options, you would like a guy like Eugenio Suarez, but at $4,000 seems a little bit too much for him, despite a really good matchup. I like him, but Johnny Peralta gets a lefty at Chase Field at $3,900, so he's the guy I'm going to be trying to get in my lineups here more often than not at shortstop.
Yeah, I'm doing the exact same thing. There's just not a ton else that I feel good about there. I mean, Peralta at 3,900, Correa at 4,700. That's two guys I'm probably going to alternate with the most. And outside of that, I'm probably going to go value. I mentioned DeJesus at second base already. He's just as good, if not a better play at shortstop. I don't want to go Cesar Hernandez at 2,800 against DeGrom today. I'd prefer to avoid that. So, I mean, it's basically three guys at shortstop for me today. Maybe mix in a couple other guys in GPPs.
Yep, I'll throw out Wilmer Flores as well. I mean, he had a really big series in course, but a couple big games for that too. And he actually hits lefties really well. So $3,500, I don't think he's a bad option at all, but I would much rather just pay the extra $400 and get Peralta, though. At least in cash games.
Yep.
Outfield options, you got Nelson Cruz against the lefty. He's at home, but it doesn't matter where he is against the lefty. You got to like him at $5,300. Probably more of a tournament option, of course, because of his price and the lack of cheap pitching. Other guys to consider near the top, A.J. Pollock has 11 hits in his last 3 games. Tough matchup against Lance Lynn, and he's the most expensive player, but for those reasons, he'll probably be fairly low owned, I would imagine. So definitely like that. And then a guy coming off a huge game last night, Steven Piscotty at $3,800, especially if he's batting in the top half of the order there. You got to like him. And another guy who just seems way too cheap. Pirates have a huge team total, but Andrew McCutcheon's only $4,500 against Tom Kohler, so I like him quite a bit.
Yeah, I do also. Not a ton of like elite matchups today. You mentioned most of them. One I think is pretty interesting for GPPs is Cespedes at 5,100 against Morgan. We know he had that big first game in Colorado and kind of really cooled off after that. I just have a lot of confidence in his talent, and I think at 5,100 he's going to be way under-owned against a really weak lefty. Not an elite park factor or anything, but I think he's got a ton of upside in this matchup. Nelson Cruz is probably the number one guy I want against DuBront. I really like targeting all these guys on Seattle that hit lefties really well. I know it's hard to like stack them because Cano and Seager are both much worse against left-handed pitchers, but I think if you're looking at like Cruz and Trumbo and stuff like that, I think you can get some nice value there. Obviously, Cruz is really expensive, and he should be because he's got a 481, 338 WOBA ISO split against lefties on the season still, which is just insane. Like, I have all of my stuff like that color-coded, and Nelson Cruz is like the absolute darkest green you can possibly be.
You can't even read the numbers. It just has a check mark. It says
yes.
Yeah,
it's like, yes, right. I mean, he's just probably my favorite play on the day overall. Another interesting guy, I know I mentioned earlier in the podcast that I don't really like the Colorado bats outside of Colorado that much, but Carlos Gonzalez is the exception for me. Yeah. It's only 3,900 today. Which is a ridiculous discount on a guy that is not only red hot, but he's been so hot that his season-long numbers are up to 415 against righties and WOBA, 333 in ISO. I mean, the guy's been absolutely on fire. That's just way, way too cheap for him. I think he's going to be pretty heavily owned, even though that game's in Atlanta.
Yeah, and I mean, Tehran, that is his biggest weakness is fly balls and lefties,
yep.
So you got to like that. And Gonzalez has 17 homers in his last 33 games, which is just ridiculous pace.
Yeah.
And his teammate Charlie Blackmon's $100 more, and I mean certainly doesn't have the upside that Gonzalez has, but Tehran does struggle with lefties. You assume Przinsky will not be in the lineup, which is unfortunate for Blackmon. Make it a lot easier for him to steal bases,
yep.
But I think he's a good contrarian GPP play tonight, though, because everyone will be on Gonzalez at almost the exact same price.
Yeah. A couple more middle of the pack guys. Preston Tucker against Eovaldi is a solid play at 3,200. And then I mentioned Ben Paulson at first base. I like him more in the outfield if you're looking at more Colorado guys. He's only 2,900. Like I said, I don't love the Colorado guys, but they are all underpriced today, so you can feel decent about that. Mostly because there aren't any really cheap guys that I'm super excited about. I mean, Coco Crisp is a guy that I've been playing a decent amount, even though I don't like it, but he's facing Iwakuma today. The one guy that I like that's really cheap today is Johnny Gomes is probably going to be hitting 4th or 5th for Atlanta against De La Rosa, and he's just absolutely crushed lefties again this year. 365 WOBA, 162 ISO. He's a guy I basically slot in against lefty every time he plays. He's always really close to minimum, and always has a nice batting spot against lefties for Atlanta because they're really split heavy. Him and Adonis Garcia are a nice mini stack today if you're looking for some cheap players.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And I'll throw out one more guy like for GPPs, Colby Rasmus, another power lefty at Yankee Stadium. And that's going to wrap things up. Find us on Twitter at DF Cafe. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Check out all of our great content at dailyfantasycafe.com.